Ladies in an aviary. A flat, lovely sugar trail, a flock lump, sugar tremor, a flutter man, sugar up, a folded man, sweep us, a four massive sweet us, a forgotten, modest tassels values, a fringe, more than veneration, a frosted naive, that very agitate gas, nasty that visitor, among get of that waiting, and glistening of the what, and globes of the wow, and great of the who, and groups of the whole, and hands of the wings, and here of the wires, angels, higher, of the wistfully, are his of the with, our holding of the with, an hourglass on the woman's, as if on the wood, as impatience on the you, as in on the, as an out, there, as an out there, aspiration in poofs, there, at in pouting there, aviary in, recompose there, azaleas, in relief there, be, inquisitive replies, there, be inquisitive retiring, them, breasts into ribbon, these brings is rise, there, burns is ruffles, they, bustles is running, they, cage is satin, they, cannot be satisfied, they, close it sedately, they, clouds, it settle, they, cries it, shadows this, curves it, shift this, diamond lacy, so throws, dispelling ladies, so tis, down, lashes solitaires to, eat ladies, soul to, existence, lift star to, feathers light starry to, fictitious like strong to, figures look sugar to, fingers love sugar to.
Oh, I adore that poem. So I think I want to start out with the framing of this book and how you came to the title and kind of what the inspiration was. I know that Mina Loy's Lady in the Aviary plays a significant role in the formation of this book and even kind of the origins of this book. So could you talk about how it informs it?
So this book is was definitely a process. I mean, it was a long time in figuring out what the book itself was going to be, and it was also like a long time of writing and then a long time between the writing and then it becoming a book. But I do feel like this book became, probably a year or two into the writing of it, more of like a project book. And that was when I found Mina Loy's poem, which is titled Ladies in an Aviary. Let me tell you a little bit about it. So I found this poem in a copy of The Last Lunar Baedeker, which is a collected poems sort of at the USC libraries. And so I was reading it because I was reading modernists at that time, and just reading it and thinking, Mina Loy, she's okay, I don't know. And then this poem called Ladies in an Aviary really jumped out at me. And it was in, first of all, it's a prose poem. And then it was in a section kind of near the back of the book that was called Ready-Mades. So the section was titled Ready-Mades, and it had, I don't know, 8 or 10 little prose poems in there. And Ladies in an Aviary really stood out to me because it spoke to some of the themes that I was writing on currently before I'd even met the poem. So thinking about women, thinking about enclosure, thinking about gardens, thinking about birds. And so I was really fascinated by the poem itself. And then I became fascinated by the project of the poem. Like I started finding out a little bit more about Mina Loy. I started finding out a little bit more about this ready-made section. I found out that she hadn't necessarily written that as a poem, or she hadn't necessarily written that to become in that book. And so it said in this section, Ready-Mades, there was like a little note in the back. So the editor for this edition of The Last Lunar Baedeker was Roger L. Conover. And so there was a little note in the back that said something about these have been assembled from various fragments. And I thought, oh, okay, assembled from fragments into this prose poem. It has fallen to me, what should I do with this? Now I have these fragments. Maybe Mina Loy wrote them, probably she wrote them. Maybe they were together as this before, maybe they came together, I don't know. So it sort of became a mystery for me to find out more about. And I also felt like the origin of this poem, that it had already been assembled by someone else, not necessarily the author, gave me some permission to think about reassembling or disassembling or working with the language a little bit more.
There's so many levels of meaning making happening within this text, which I really dig, and so much emphasis on process. I love how that it's erasure. I love that it's reinforcing this idea of repetition and revision. So often with art, I talk a lot about Black American literature dealing constantly with repetition and revision, and you see that here as well too. And so I was wondering if you could talk, how did you come up with 4 sections? How did you assemble the assembly that you received?
Mm-hmm. It was a long time in the making, and there was a long process to it, I think, and I actually started writing the poems in this book, and the book itself, like the beginning of the book, starts with poems that were very interested in these themes that I was just talking about, enclosure, femininity, birds, that kind of thing. So like I had set up a bird feeder in our little back patio area, and I was basically like watching the birds and kind of writing poems about what those birds were doing and what kinds of sounds they were making, and the repetitions that those birds were making. Like it became, you know, it wasn't this enclosed space. There were variations, but they were always variations within the theme that was happening. So that was sort of how the book began for me. Not that I knew it was a book then, but that's what the poems were doing. And then when I found Mina Loy's poem, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. Maybe here's a way to expand my enclosure, right? Thinking about her language, how I could use some of her language that was language that I wouldn't necessarily use on my own. Like there were some words like, I don't know, like breast and pout and massive, like words like that like were not already in, you know, my vocabulary for this book or like my general poem vocabulary. So those became really interesting to me. And then I was also, as I had begun writing, I was like, okay, this enclosure is great. This little backyard patio bird feeder scene has fed me a lot of things in my poems, but I was also thinking about how I could move beyond that, or what would be a similar location. And so I was interested in Loy's idea of the aviary, right, which is an enclosure for birds, where like they're wild and free, but also they cannot get out. And so I was thinking about like what other sort of natural spaces might be appropriate extensions of my little like backyard apartment patio. And so I started to move into other similar spaces. Mostly like I wrote a lot of these poems outside with my birds. And then I also started going to local botanic gardens and other like enclosed, natural, but like bordered by city, you know, like, so they're natural, but they're totally not natural spaces. So I wrote a lot of the poems at like the Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden in Claremont, at the Huntington Garden in Pasadena, at the Arboretum in Baldwin Park. So like I went to a lot of different places that seemed to speak to this theme of like enclosure, natural, but protected. And so that was sort of another expansion of the book. So I think that in some ways, the book kind of follows the progression ultimately, and I had ordered it a few different ways, but this is the way it really wanted to be. It follows kind of the progression of my finding and expanding the enclosure that I was working with. So I would say the first section, very much within my backyard patio, and then after that, I start bringing in the Loy language. And then after that, I start going to more garden locations and writing there and still incorporating that Loy language. I would, as the project of writing these poems, like go to the garden, find a space and write there and see what I saw and think about how it felt to be in that space. And so one of the things that happened is, I mean, I guess in some ways, like I became, you know, kind of the bird inside the aviary. I mean, not that people were coming to the garden to look at me, but like I was there, I was enclosed in that garden space. People could see that I was there and I could leave eventually once I found the gate, you know? But so it was a really interesting position to put myself in as a body and to be part of, I think, the visual of that garden, the experience of that garden for other people. And then it was also really interesting to start thinking about how Loy had done that with her poem, Ladies in an Aviary, where she like literally, or figuratively, I suppose, constructs the aviary, fills it with these women sitting around preening as if they're birds, and then sort of talks about the problematics of that image. And so I sort of kept having that in the back of my head as well as I was writing. And I think that this idea of enclosure and thinking about being seen, putting oneself in a position where something could happen or something couldn't happen because of the places I was going to, really lent itself to think too about the words that Loy was using and how I could reposition those words to do something else within my poems. So it kind of invited this. I know we were talking a little bit about intertextuality and erasure and borrowing language. It also really made me think about how her language was moving on the page, like the garden of the page, and how I could start moving that language within that. So really thinking about placement.
No, I totally dig that, and kind of gets me thinking of William Carlos Williams' idea of, like, the open field of action and such, and kind of inscribing oneself into that field of action. And I think another way that interests me that you achieve that is with the parentheses so often. And I think a great example of that is Dies in the Aviary.
The title, Dies in Aviary, the title is in parentheses, and the title is a phrase from Mina Loy's prose poem. So whenever I use her words as titles, I do put them in parentheses. But I was really interested in thinking about, there are a lot of parentheses in this book, first of all, but I was really interested in thinking about using the parentheses as sort of enclosures, for her words, for my words, for other things that are happening. So here, her title, her language, and the title is part of the enclosure. Dies in Aviary. They are so lovely, their breasts. They trail their lacy, their lashes they lift. Solitaires on their fingers shift up and down, waiting, running to eat, very wistfully. And that poem is an erasure of Loy's prose poem. So all of those words in that poem belong to her. And the spaces, I guess the pauses in some way, are things that are left out, but we can get a little bit of an image of those women in the aviary in that poem.
There's so much about the speaker looking out and also while being seen, like observer while observing, and kind of that nexus. And I think that's cool because it breaks down the barrier between human and nature, this kind of false binary that we've created and reinforced again and again. And I often like to think about eco-poetry as doing that, and nature poetry not, right? Nature poetry would always kind of be like a speaker looking out to the world and finding some kind of revelation, right? And I think, in so many ways, eco-poetry ends up being nature poetry imbued with politics and imbued with kind of decentering humans. It was that part of your thinking when you were assimilating this? Is this an eco-poetry text?
I would say that it is. One of the things that I was really interested in trying to do when I first started writing these poems, before I even met Loy's poem, was thinking about how to represent the outside world on the page. And so I was really interested in trying to accumulate the sounds, to have those repetitions of like the wind that comes and then it comes again. I was interested in trying to figure out how to get that experience of being part of the outside world, the natural world, onto the page. Loy is, I would say, I don't know if she's a political poet, but she's a pointed poet. She is trying to make assertions in many of her poems. And Ladies in an Aviary is certainly an assertive poem. And it is asserting things that I was not yet asserting in my poems, although I know that, those themes are underlying there. But I think having her assertion of like, here are women in this cage, it is wrong, was essentially what she's saying, right? And I'm like, oh, okay, she can say that. Maybe I can like try to push on those themes a little bit more. Maybe I can lean on that. And so I did start trying to be a little bit more overt in pulling on those threads. I think that, eco-poetry is always going to be political, whether it is overt or not, because we're talking about our world that we live in and we're drawing attention to certain things in that world. So I don't know that my book is like overtly political in that way, but I do feel like drawing attention to these natural wild spaces that are in fact always enclosed by fences, that are bordered by freeways, that have helicopters in the distance. I feel like it's a smaller assertion that I'm making. And then also thinking about how women are living in that world, are part of that world, and how we have to interact in certain ways within those enclosures or outside of them. The window's the fence. If I hadn't been able to begin it if the springtime hadn't come, the shoots hadn't put us to it. Secret digging in the garden, down upon wings, creating the new undergrowth, the notion, listen, a siren, astride the bare branch, a reflection off the web along the grass, the one smudge that glistens, home, the last place, the fenced place. We let ourselves suffer its motion, limited by the holding line, the sun creeping, the shade, the lure of the soft petal, the bird that stays, enough of the bud, the branch to root, smooth versus dirt, landing versus taking flight. The windows aren't enough. The fence surrounds the yard and is too tall. The drain pipe stopped even. Rivals, these branches allowed their reach. Animals, their roam. What of the distance? Only rooftops, treetops, fortressed out, undebatable, taunting limbs and limping.
The momentum that you achieve with this, the pacing is so fast. It just takes off sprinting. It feels so much like collage and like this collision of fragments. Is that something you were going for? Is that part of the assemblage? It feels like that's kind of echoing the architecture of the whole text.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mentioned when I was talking about like the eco-poetics angle, like trying to reflect what was actually happening in the poem. So trying to reflect the rhythm of what was happening. And so that's definitely something that I was trying to do. I was trying to capture everything, which of course is impossible when you are using a page or a line. But I was really interested in trying to, create a rhythm to take people in and out of whatever sounds are happening in nature, you know, the breeze or the trees moving or the animals. And in this poem, one of the things that struck me as I was reading it is thinking this is a poem that was in like my little backyard patio area, I remember. But one of the things that struck me in reading it is the things that are reaching outside of the fence, like those limbs that are reaching over, the animals that are here but they're allowed to leave. And so I was really trying to like capture the entirety of that scene, which is a small enclosed scene, but to put everything in. And when I was writing, like when I did these original drafts for this poem, I remember, or all these poems in here, I remember telling myself, I was like, don't censor, put it all in. You can always take it out later, right? So my pages and pages of scribbling that happened early on in these drafts are just full of things. And I think that is actually, that's one of the original moments that the parentheses came in, was when I was drafting, I'd just be like, oh, this, or maybe it's this, or maybe it's this, but I would just let it accumulate so that I could decide later. And so I did end up keeping a lot of that accumulation.
Accumulation of adjustments, it feels like, of like, it's this, and it's this, and it's this, and it's this. And so much of that comes from the observing. And especially, I want to circle back to this idea of the things that are reaching out of the enclosement, the things that are in that liminal space. So for the speaker, that outsideness, is that the point of liberation or is that the point of meaning?
I think in some ways it's the point of liberation, but it's also the point, like the enclosure is something that you can escape out of, but it is also a protective enclosure. I'm comfortable in a lot of spaces, right? But like as a woman alone, or like a woman alone who is going to be immersed in writing and looking down and not necessarily paying attention to, like, I don't know, the people who might be farther away from me. I did know that those garden spaces were protected. You know, like I knew that there was safety within that enclosure for me, and I didn't have to worry about, I don't know, people walking by or somebody snatching my purse or like whatever it is, you know, like, so I do feel like the enclosure is safety in a lot of ways. But it is also, yes, a barrier. And it's a barrier, like knowing, I guess we're coming back to the idea of like femininity and sexuality and that sort of thing. It's also a barrier of knowing that, like, because I'm safe in that barrier, I'm someone else within that barrier versus like who I would be when I left, or what sort of person I might change into outside of there. So,
could you read the poem A Trimmer of Ribbon? Because I think that it has that lookout feeling and that bothness of the power of seeing and naming, but also the vulnerability as well of being looked at while doing that.
A tremor of ribbon. The creek brushing past or the rocks that surround it, the path wavering up the low hill, dotted, strewn, bent, with dry leaves in the slight wind that comes to turn the trees, show them off, lean them down, the bench from which to watch, the spinning leaf, the wandering hair, the shudder from above, against the click of the mechanical, the chains strung up together, married like people do. The sign which informs, the letters to reveal us, each lift in the rock a purposeful irony, a faceless opening, the net under the grass to catch us if we shift about, empty streambed, useless container, rainwater collector. As the voice moves along down the path, stop and sway, pause and look, point on a favorite, so unapologetic, rhododendron, the type of shout that travels, the poem that stabs despite inaction, that pauses to pose in silhouette and bounds forward, body like a bending river. Body is a short-haired animal and uncomfortable in being so observed.
The text moves from the garden to Loy to these different gardens. And so I start thinking a little bit about like Blanchard's like kind of poetics of space and the way each space kind of ends up informing our poetics and what we're doing. How did those different gardens, the non-Vive gardens, how did those gardens kind of change where you were going into projection of the book?
Yeah, the gardens were really interesting, and they definitely invited new things into the poem. I mean, kind of like how Mina Loy's poem invited new language, and these gardens invited new language as well. And the poem that I just read, I recall, was one that I had initially composed at the Huntington Garden in the Chinese garden as it was being built. So that's the river that was like concrete and it wasn't quite there yet. And then people would walk by and somebody in fact shouted rhododendron. They were like naming plants. So like those are words that came from my experience of being part of the garden. And then the other thing that happened was I felt like, so the gardens were enclosed, right? So they were these sort of private spaces, but we had other people walking through them. So people showed up sometimes in these poems. But also the sounds were things that I noticed really traveled. So obviously there are the flowers, there's the plants, there's the signage, there's a little bit of movement within the garden. But then I would hear things that are not part of that garden space. And you can hear them coming up in some of these poems. So there's a siren, there's an airplane, there are voices that I can't see or that are outside the garden, but I hear them coming in. And so that was really exciting too, I think, to have this extra level of something that I couldn't anticipate, like I would not know what it was until I got there. And then it could kind of work its way into the accumulation of the poem.
The making of these poems and the space in which they're made is just as important as the content and the meaning of them. And that kind of tussle, it feels as though that this text almost prioritizes that making over meaning.
I would agree with that. I mean, I feel like I was very interested in, through the poems themselves, articulating their making, like making them like a record of their own making, essentially. And so I feel like, yes, that is what those poems are doing, is trying to talk about the process of how to make a poem, what a poem is, at the same time as they are doing some of this other work.
I mean, I had to write that one down, a record of their own making. Like, that's really, really cool.
That's actually, it's a quote about artist books from Joanna Drucker, who said it the artist book as a record of its own making. My work is within artist books, and I love thinking about books as objects, and this book as an object, of course. But I was really interested in thinking about, like, how do we do that not visually, right? Because an artist book, you're doing it visually, you're making that visual record. And so I was like, how can I do that in a poem? How can I also make the poem a record?
Thank you so much for talking with me. And you know what my favorite poem in the book is. We've talked about this. Here is Love. Could you please take us out with that one, my friend?
Here is Love. In the street, beneath a tree, upon the sidewalk, in the arms, in the branches, between the clouds, in the shade, in the morning, against the curtain, below the sunlight, against the flowers, across the lawn, among the blue pincushions, the biting lilies, the stranded screen, against the rock wall, in the awning, beneath the draperies, in the meadow, against the river, in the dust there, in the earth, among the daylight, the ivied leaves, within the boundaries, up the driveway, after the culvert, under the shelving, in the garden, circled by scenery, in the sunlight, in the breeze, under the blue spruce, against the fan palm, in the grove, adrift in safety, wrapped by end lines, for an occasion, inside the park, beyond the entrance in the clearing, in the dry river, below the hawk bleat, in the road, in the density, in the coming upon it, in the woodland, in the garden, in the cleared land, among the policies of the soil, in the reclaiming by the water, beyond the watchers, in the care by the entrance, in the thick of it, beneath bare branches, in the leaves adjoining the causeway, in the lighting, in the spyglass, in the sanity, in the asking along the road, in the coming in the distance, in the observed near the maple, beside the sunlight, in the strewn leaves, among the animals, in the night sounds, in the leaving by the open field, in the asking, in the description, in the enclosure, by the deed.
Love it. Loving the process, loving the details, not what Levis said, not deity. Loving the details, loving the process. Thank you so much, Viv.
Thank you.